Pragmatic Future for Nape, Containing Costs and Updating Technologies. We're fortunate today to have 3 members of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine panel put together to address the problems of measuring educational progress in an age of AI and pervasive computation. In addition to the 3 members of the panel, we have 2 respondents representing the 2 agencies that most need to hear, receive, and do the work implied by this report. I'm Lori Shepard, and my particular connection to Nape and why I was asked, thanks AERA, Christy, very much for the invitation. Since this report just came out, we were added to the program. I'm happy to be the chair. I first served on an evaluation panel for Nape in 1975. When there was a blue ribbon panel commissioned by the Education Commission of the States to examine Nape. And I remember that one of our findings was that Nape needed to be more policy relevant. And I think we just imagined that Nagb would come along someday. I was also part of the National Academy of Education review of the trial stage assessments in the early 90s. And then since 1995, I want to shout out to George Bornstead in the audience, part of the Nape Validity Studies panel that is administered by AIR. My role will be to introduce the panel, and then I was invited by AERA to say 5 minutes worth of comments and then turn it over to our 2 respondents. When this was moved from a Friday to a Saturday event, it created a conflict for me, which means that I turn into Cinderella and run out the door at 5:15. And Andrew Ho has agreed to lead the last part of discussion from the audience, because we figure if you're in this room, you're somehow part of the Nape community. So thank you for being here, spread out as you are. And then there'll be final words from Andrew at the very end. So to introduce the panel members, I'm starting with Karen Mitchell. I'll introduce them all, and then they know the order of operations following from that. Karen was the chair of the panel. She's recently retired as senior director of the Medical College Admissions Test, MCAT. And she, in that role, oversaw, among other things, the 2015 launch of the current version of the MCAT and its continued administration bravely during COVID. She has directed research on validity of large-scale accountability and selection tests in her work at RAND previously and at the U.S. Army Research Institute for the Behavioral and Social Sciences. As senior program officer earlier at NRC, she had the relevant work for this particular task, where she looked at the co-directed the congressionally mandated evaluation of Nape and also worked on the Clinton era national voluntary tests. Andrew Ho is Charles William Eliot Professor of Education at Harvard. And his research there appropriately focuses on design, use, and interpretation of test scores in educational policy and practice. He's an elected member of the National Council on Measurement in Education Board of Directors and a trustee of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Importantly, he served 2 terms on the National Assessment Governing Board, where he chaired the Committee on Standards, Design, and Methodology. Most recently, he was elected to the National Academy of Education. Congratulations. Jack Buckley is head of assessment and learning scientists at Roblox. Previously, he was president and chief scientist at Imbolus, a game-based assessment technology startup highly relevant to the technological emphasis of the work that this panel was asked to examine. As senior vice president at AIR, he led the research and evaluation area and then continues as an AIR fellow in his role leading the Nape Validity Studies panel. Earlier, in the early part of this century, he was, I tried to look it up, but I couldn't get the exact dates. So he was first deputy commissioner and then commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics. So I mean to emphasize, not make light of the importance of that role. Our two respondents start with Leslie Muldoon, who is executive director of the National Assessment Governing Board. Her background is in assessment and nonprofit governance and management. She helped launch PARC, the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, one of the two multi-stage consortia funded to develop next generation assessments under Race to the Top. And I note in her bio, it says that she supported the participation of state leaders through the design, development, and implementation of PARC, a role that makes her perfectly suited for Nagb. She also played a leading role in creating and managing two nonprofit organizations that provided the organizational home for those assessment systems. Peggy Carr will be with us remotely because of a family circumstance. She is the commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics. She served for 20 years as associate commissioner, and in that role was responsible for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, along with international assessments, et cetera. On the website, her bio mentions that she previously oversaw the transformative transition of NAEP from paper and pencil to digitally based assessments. And I figured that was probably one of about a gajillion things that she oversaw during those 20 years. Prior to joining NCES, she served as the chief statistician for the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. So we'll start with Karen, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Lori. Those were lovely introductions. And I want to thank you all for taking the time this afternoon to come to this session and to hear about the National Academy's recently released report called The Pragmatic Future of NAEP, Containing Costs and Updating Technologies. And I want to start by speaking for the panel members and giving our appreciation to our colleagues at IES, NCES, and Nagb for the enormous time and effort that they put into this study. They provided mountains of documentation. They answered our many, many questions, often answering the same questions multiple times. They attended parts of our meetings. They reviewed parts of our reports for accuracy, and then they reviewed the embargoed copy of the report and provided their comments on it. So they put a great deal of time and effort into the work of this study panel, and we're grateful. As Lori said, Andrew, Jack, and I will use the next half hour to talk about the panel's methods and their recommendations. And here's what we're going to talk about. We'll start with a description of the charge to the committee and the process that the committee used to do its work. We'll talk about the approach that the panel took to the study, and then we'll talk about the structure of NAEP, not because it's unfamiliar to you. I know that that you know it well, but being able to think about the way that we describe the structure of the program helps to understand the cost data that we'll be talking about this afternoon. And then we'll describe the panel's 21 recommendations. So the panel was asked to consider the ways that NAEP could maintain its role as a leader in educational assessment without being cost prohibitive. So we were asked to consider innovations that had the potential for improvement in the next couple of years and to recommend those that might improve the cost effectiveness of NAEP while maintaining its technical quality and information value. And among the things that we were asked to consider were automatic item generation, remote test administration, which we'll talk about as local administration of NAEP in this afternoon's discussion. We'll talk about, we were asked to consider computer adaptive testing and the consolidation and elimination of overlaps across tests, both within the NAEP assessments themselves and between NAEP and the international assessments, TIMSS and PEARLS and PISA. The concern that NAEP is expensive is a concern that makes people worry about the viability of the program. So our charge came with a sense of urgency in relationship to the costs of the program. So the study started with interviews of 16 experts who reflected on the status of the current program and thought about its future. Those experts highlighted some themes that the committee then considered in the process of conducting the study. Then an 11-member panel was appointed, including experts, of course, in psychometrics and measurement, in large-scale assessment, in design science, in research, and in the relevant technologies. The panel then held 3 virtual committee meetings, during which we had enormously helpful conversations with our colleagues from IES, NCES, and Nagb. We then studied the documentation that we received from those organizations, along with the research literature and industry practice on technologies that had the potential for improvement of NAEP. The panel then came to consensus on 21 recommendations and wrote its report. The first draft of the report was reviewed by leaders in the National Academy. The panel revised the report in response to those reviews, and then the report went out for review by 13 external experts. And if you're able to see a copy of the report, those experts are listed in the preface of the report. The panel then revised the report in response to those recommendations and were able to meet the review criteria of the Academy and make those changes in ways that satisfied the Academy's review monitor and review coordinator. This is a list of the members of the panel and their institutional affiliations. I'll leave that up for a moment so you can see the cast of characters. Because of the focus on cost, the panel broadened its consideration beyond the 4 topics that we talked about a couple of slides ago to include other major costs of the program. So it also considered automated scoring, the technological infrastructure for the assessment, and then program planning, support, management, and oversight. The committee also discussed some innovations that have the potential for improving the program in technical ways and for their information value, but that wouldn't be expected to decrease costs. And you'll see as we talk through the recommendations that they avoid considering cost savings from eliminating any of the assessments. So the recommendations that we'll discuss maintain the current commitment to the subject areas that are tested, the grades or age levels that are tested, and the periodicity of the assessments. So you all know this, but NAEP administers assessments in 10 subject areas at grades 4, 8, and 12. A separate second program administers, called Long-Term Trend NAEP, administers assessments in reading and math to 9, 13, and 17-year-olds. Across the 2 assessment programs and for a typical 4-year period, NAEP administers 22 assessments on average. So here we're talking about an assessment in a particular subject area in a given grade or age level and on a particular occasion. So there are 22 of those on average in a typical 4-year period. And of the 22, 10 provide state and sometimes large urban district estimates, 12 provide national estimates only. And we're talking about this way of considering assessments as a way of putting the cost data in context. So the current annual budget for NAEP is $175.2 million. And costs have increased substantially since 2000 for lots of really important reasons. In 2002, there came the mandate for state assessments in reading and math at grades 4 and 8. The trial urban districts assessments were then added. There are now 27 districts participating in the program. 12th grade assessments were then added, and then the recent transition to computer-based administration added costs. So these costs include a complex alliance of contractors. There are about a dozen contractors who do much of the work of the program. It also includes a complex group of advisory bodies. There are about a dozen of those. And so those advisory bodies help NCES and Nagb with things like framework development, subject area test development, item review, and so on. So the average cost per assessment, when you think of an assessment as being a test by subject area, individual, grade or age, and occasion, is $31.8 million. And the report makes comparisons between NAEP's costs and the costs of other testing programs, but because of NAEP's distinctive characteristics, it was hard to find perfect comparators for NAEP. And it's also hard to find the full, find public data on the full costs of other testing programs. So the report talks about the costs of the PISA assessment and the Colorado State assessment. And though neither offers an apples to apples comparison for NAEP, both suggest the high costs of NAEP. So here's a little bit of detail on the cost structure for the program. So listed in that left column is the work of the program, item development, test administration, scoring, and so on. And on the right are the proportional costs of that work. So I'll leave that up there for a second so you can see the relative costs of the different parts of the work. So at a high level, it's important to say that NAEP is a complex program with a complex cost structure and a complex contract structure. And despite the great deal of information that NCES and Nagb provided to the panel about the cost of the program, the panel had difficulty understanding those costs and tying them to the major program components. And that led the panel to its first recommendation, which is that NCES and Nagb should develop clear, consistent, and complete descriptions of current spending by component, and to use them when making major decisions to make sure that the budget supports the decisions that are being made. Here are the topics that the remaining recommendations of the report treat. So Andrew will get up next and he'll talk about possible structural changes that might save costs and improve quality and information value. Then he'll talk about item development. Then Jack will get up and talk about the committee's recommendations on test administration and automated scoring. Then Andrew will get back up and talk about analysis and reporting and technological infrastructure. And then I will get back up to talk about management, planning, support, and oversight. You are welcome.
Hello, everybody. I also want to start just by congratulating Peggy Carr because she is the 2022 winner of the Distinguished Public Service Award from AERA, and that is a very, very deserving honor indeed. So that was recently announced, and I just wanted to give Peggy a shout out. Yeah. So I want to talk about structural changes first. I guess I can start by saying, again, NAEP has a reputation, as you know, for being the gold standard. And so it's a little bit of a confused metaphor, but you could think about this as like the gold standard doesn't need to cost this much gold, right? Or another way to think about it is, can we improve and use the gold better than we currently do? So one of the first questions, one of the questions we asked was, is the long-term trend that attracts that tracks progress for now going back 50 years, redundant with the main NAEP product that answers questions about trends for states and districts that goes back 30 years. And you might think, why don't we just sunset them because we have two watches and that's confusing. The panel, maybe you could think of it as thinking about the two numbers that are part of your blood pressure, right? Sometimes two numbers are good. And so we suggested that NCES should prepare a detailed plan and budget for long-term trend modernization, and then consider with Congress and Nagb the value of its continuation. To give you a very specific example of how long-term trend is going to very, very soon reveal important information that main NAEP couldn't, was that the 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds happened to be measured in the spring of 2020, just before a certain event that we're still dealing with now happened. And the 9-year-olds are being measured again now. 13-year-olds are going to be measured again next year. It's going to be, I think, the most authoritative answer to the question about pandemic learning loss that we're going to have. And that's an example of why sometimes two pieces of information are good, even if they sometimes seem redundant. There's also the value that the long-term trend adds for age-based measurement. And then, of course, a 50-year trend line can be useful. Under recommendation 3.2, we have that Nagb and NCES should work to achieve smaller and more frequent updates. This has long been an interest of mine. NAEP faces a challenge, the challenge of measuring change in a changing world, right? And that is a difficult challenge indeed. And part of measuring change, to say the old maxim, if you want to measure change, don't change the measure. Of course, we always do change the measure, but sometimes changing the measure by small degrees is wiser than having something more seismic, right? You can think about an earthquake metaphor where we want to let the plates slide over each other rather than build up pressure. And I say that realizing I'm in California now. That is recommendation 3.2. The Nagb and NCS should work to achieve smaller and more frequent updates. And part of that could involve standing framework committees that have rotating membership, much like the governing board does. And that could help to improve trend maintenance, which is the unique added value of NAEP over many, many other assessments. Under 3.3, we saw this as a very, very powerful way to potentially improve efficiency, and that is integrating assessments with overlapping content. I want to be very clear here that we tried to distinguish between combining assessments where you might lose information and integrating assessments where you might be able to borrow information and measure more efficiently and still report the same scores with the same precision. So our recommendation is that the governing board, which obviously governs this, should give high priority to considering integrating complementary subjects that are now assessed separately. And again, by integration, we mean that we might still be able to have, for example, reading scores and writing scores that are comparable over time. And also potentially science scores and technology and engineering literacy scores that are comparable over time, right? And so the idea is to have to set reporting targets for these particular scores that will be more efficient because it can borrow information from different subjects. So under recommendation section 4, we were trying to figure out, and again, I'm a psychometrician, not an accountant. So I think here, many panel members were confused about the item, excuse me, needing some water here. They were confused about the item development contract because there were pieces of the item development contract that didn't seem related to item development. And so recommendation 4.1 is that NCS should examine the costs and scope of the item development contract that are not directly related to item development to sort of separate out the item development contract from for the item development components from other pieces of that contract. So we had some confusion about that. Under recommendation 4.2, we talked about, we considered automatic item generation. And so automatic item generation seems like it could improve efficiency. The panel ended up deciding that was not necessarily advantageous. Automatic item generation tends to be good when you have large numbers of items in small domains, and that's not what NAEP does well. Instead, we did see value in, for example, improving task models that have sort of items underneath them, you can imagine, and that we saw as potentially advantageous, in addition to thinking about conceptual frameworks related to principled assessment design. Excuse me, I think this is like where I realized I should have had lunch. We also talked about the cost and value of items under recommendation 4.3, that Nagb should commission an analysis of the value and cost of different item types. You could think about multiple choice items, constructive response items, and the very, very expensive scenario-based tasks. And we wanted to see, thank you so much, Leslie. We want to see a little bit more intentionality behind the different item types that we have. So I'll say, as part of this cost benefit analysis, right, there are different benefits and different costs, right? The benefits include not just information from a psychometric perspective, but also signaling value to the field about what is important to measure and how we measure. And under the heading of cost, it's not just item development, it's also the cost in time to examinees and to schools, and the cost of potential scoring. So we just wanted to see more intentionality behind the value and cost considerations. Here is where I will pass it to Jack before I stand back up in a few slides for section 4.
All right, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
We've both presented these a few times before. So let me switch gears to our panel's recommendations on test administration, which honestly is in terms of cost reduction is probably the single most important area, partly because of the sheer proportion of the program's costs that actually go to administration. This is a very expensive program to administer in the field, but also because there's some real opportunities here to cut those costs. And so the consensus of the panel, first of all, was to congratulate the program on all the work that they've already done, laying the foundation to really take Nape. Nape has gone through many iterations of the way it's administered, but really is in a state of transition already between a current digital platform and the next generation of that platform, and how the next generation platform can be possibly administered, or really essentially needs to be administered, on schools' equipment, on schools' networks. And the program has already been investigating this. And so our recommendation was to continue down that road to work with figuring out how to administer Nape on local machines with local proctors. One thing, if you're not familiar with the program, Nape right now, even digitally, sends out teams of contractors mostly from Westat with clamshells full of computers, and they go in and they set up a network, and all the computers and all those people are government contractors, and then they pack it all up and they go off to the next site. It's extremely expensive. It's very high quality. I've been privileged to observe it many times in different schools. It's fascinating to watch, but it's definitely no other program continues that level of sort of cost. I will say one thing the panel discussed that we were concerned about is, and this comes out of some evidence that already has been generated by NCS and Nagb, that it's at this time right now, it is not necessarily easy in some jurisdictions for the federal government to walk in and say, we need to use your computers and your teachers to test kids. There was even in some friendly areas, there was pushback in terms of time and resources, and there's other places that are less enthusiastic about the federal role. That means that this actually could cost more in the short run, because if you hidden in that earlier slide that broke down all the costs of Nape, there's another line there about support. And one thing that the government has realized in kind of pushing these sorts of assessment mandates down into the states is often we need to provide some support for staffing in the Nape Service Center and a whole bunch of other kind of overhead in order to grease the wheels that way. And so it's likely that we may need to think about that in the short run here for this transition. Second recommendation in this area is sort of obvious, but we need to know if we're going to use local equipment, right, whatever's in different schools, we need to know both what that equipment is, right, and not literally, all sorts of aspects of the user experience and the user interface that kids might be faced with. But also then we need to step back sort of from the measurement perspective psychometrically and figure out how to account for that. It's a different way to think about standardization. rather than define standardization as every single kid will have the same experience. It's more like trying to figure out maybe either treating as error some of the components of that experience, or in some ways it may be the fact that a student using equipment they're familiar with may actually be, in a different sense, a different kind of standardization. But this is a very active area of concern and research, and nobody else has to solve it the way NAEP does in order to make this work. So just like in many other ways that NAEP has been the gold standard over the years, NAEP will be the first place that has to solve this problem. Also in administration, there's a further recommendation, again, more about these savings. We felt, and partly this was due to the expertise of some on the panel who had worked with the NAEP budgeting process in the past, that actually the program may be understating the potential savings here. And if we execute this well, the program might actually save more than they thought of the budget. Again, I suspect that's not a medium-term savings. That's probably a longer-term sort of steady state savings. But we did encourage a review of those estimates. So a couple other, smaller percentage improvement, but certainly longer testing sessions. It sounds terrible, but actually the program was well on the way to this change before the pandemic. The idea that actually adding a additional block of NAEP assessment for sampled students, it will require more of their time. It's more burdensome, but on the whole, for the nation, the actual burden goes down because it's a more efficient and effective way to administer NAEP. There have been a bunch of research prior to the pandemic on this, and it was the panel's recommendation that you continue down that road and make that change. And this is a perennial one. So finally, NAEP has very large sample sizes relative to certainly anything that I've ever worked on and probably ever will again. And often that leads to the unusual situations where a third decimal point difference between two groups rounds to zero and is statistically significant because there's probably a few more decimal places in NAEP. And that's led to some observers saying over the time that NAEP could probably cut the overall sample size and save money. We, as a panel, felt that's possible, but we urge the program to consider the fact that, so first of all, it's not just a question of these large state samples with very large groups like gender or large race or ethnic groups, that NAEP also has to report a lot of disaggregations all the way down to small units like within urban districts, like in Philadelphia, students with disabilities. And pretty soon that very large sample size starts to look pretty small when you continue to stratify it in all these little cells. And so there may be some ways to save money there, but honestly, NAEP has a sort of a duty, a charge by Congress to detect policy relevant differences that's laid out pretty clearly. And so we urge the program to consider that carefully. Still me. So all right. so what else? So we also considered it, if you're looking down the list of sort of modern assessment ideas, could they apply to NAEP? Adaptive testing is one that's quite obvious that comes up all the time. NAEP is very different from a lot of other assessments and assessment programs that have successfully adopted different kinds of adaptive assessment. Primarily, one uses some kind of adaptation either to improve the precision of estimates, right, by getting better standard errors for the same amount of assessment time, or by reducing that assessment time, right? You're doing one or the other. I suppose you could trade off both. NAEP, because it doesn't produce student level scores, it's got a different objective than every other program. And that means that adaptation could help, but it's likely, we're not trying to reduce an individual student's time. In fact, if we got more time out of this, we'd probably assess more things. What we are trying to do, though, is cover that content. And the program has done some interesting staged adaptive, so not item level adaptation, but staged adaptive experimentation that is promising. The reason why for NAEP, it's likely that only some sort of staged approach would work is that the content constraints are really restrictive. NAEP, when you look at what the test blueprint for NAEP, everything it tells you have to do, especially as Andrew mentioned, these scenario-based tasks and these testlets that have all kinds of components to them that are very hard to make adaptive unless you just take the whole chunk. That's probably about the only way to do it. And that's unlikely to really save much in terms of cost, although it still could improve measurement. So we encourage that, but we're not hopeful about a lot of cost savings as a panel. We also looked at, NCES, in addition to administering NAEP, is out in the field in American schools with all sorts of other data collections, including on its various cycles, the TIMS and the PEARLS and the PISA assessments, which, like cicadas in his comment on the panel yesterday, occasionally all overlap and happen in the same year. And that happened to me once, but usually they're all on different cycles. But often people are out there in the schools collecting data. And it was sort of an obvious question. It was an obvious question to me when I was in the government to say, well, can't we like do this in one big window and just sort of get in there once and save money? It's really hard. There are all the requirements are different, both in terms of how the mode of administration, like what accommodations are allowed or provided or not allowed. Just trying to coordinate. It's unlikely to save. It would probably just drive everybody crazy. And I'm not aware of any easy way to implement that, but we did explore it as a possibility. And automated scoring. This is my last one. So finally, automated scoring is a no-brainer, the panel felt. Absolutely, to the extent possible, machine scoring is being used already in some aspects in NAEP, but certainly around the assessment industry and for all sorts of things, right? Automated scoring is more effective than human scoring at grading essays, large essays, small essays, even now medium-sized essays. We strongly recommend that the program continue. Back in the early days, pre-digital NAEP, I remember the scoring component of the budget was like $25 million alone. That's gotten down to some extent because of already automated scoring built into some of the digital components, but we urge the program to continue to try to implement more improvement there.
I think the Boston Celtics are playing now, so just like Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, sometimes you have to rotate off the court, and I'm glad to have that break, and I'll have to have a snack after this to recharge. So under recommendation 8.1, we talked about reporting and thinking about the various audiences of NAEP. Certainly there's the public, but we felt that there could also be innovations and attention to building a more efficient research infrastructure. Can we make raw data from NAEP available more quickly? Can we improve the usability and sophistication of the NAEP Data Explorer? Can we make process data, and by that we mean the click stream of people interacting with NAEP items? Can we make that more easily available? And can we expand the availability and use of contextual variables? Again, thinking about reporting not just as the reports themselves to the public, but the way that we can make more efficient data availability, thinking of researchers, right? And the knowledge that researchers generate as one of the key goals of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So we can avoid sort of headline-driven, what we call misnapery, right? And instead focus on more powerful research by disciplined researchers and journalists, including potentially bringing some of them in earlier under embargo, so that not only a big NAEP report can come out, but in addition and in parallel, some research reports that can dig into the numbers a bit more and answer more sophisticated research questions. And then finally, for me at least, the technological infrastructure was something we paid a lot of attention to. I think just like the item development contract, we found it difficult to sort of see the values and mission in the budget, right? And so that's what this relates to. So NCES should regularly evaluate software components built by others for use in next-gen ENAPE. You could think about this contract as this lumbering sort of it felt sort of lumbering and confounded to us. And so a more component by component breakdown and a way of thinking about the platform would be valuable. Recommendation 9.2 is that NCES should ensure there's adequate expertise related to enterprise software development to support and oversee the development of next-gen ENAPE. You could think about this again as that, we have a lot of psychometricians and statisticians, but we also need people thinking about technology and software development. And then under 9.3, NCS should seek expert guidance from enterprise application developers and educational technologists about the platform's projected costs. So again, we're trying to think component by component here, make sure we have adequate expertise for the technology platform, right? These things change and advance rapidly. We should be able to switch out components, right? And be able to seek expert guidance from enterprise application developers and technologists. And now I will pass it to Karen.
Thank you, Andrew. And I will talk about the last two of the panel's recommendations, and then we'll invite Lori to give her comments on the report. So the panel's research revealed that that work on cost reduction would be incomplete without consideration of the cost for management planning, support, and oversight activities. So they're a large portion of NAEP's expenses. 28.7% of NAEP's budget is given to the costs of the NAEP staff at NCES and to the Nagb staff and their other direct costs, and then two dedicated management support contracts. These costs probably reflect the complex design of the alliance contracts and the complex review and approval process for much of the work that happens with NAEP. There are also additional costs for management planning, support, and oversight that are in the contracts that do the testing work for NAEP. So the contracts for item development, test administration, scoring, and so on. And though we didn't have access to all of the data on those costs because they're proprietary, we estimated that the rough cost of that work in the non-support contracts ranged from about $12.5 million to $18.8 million. So that adds to the $50 million that we've just talked about. So the large size of these costs led the panel to recommend that NCES and Nagb should commission an independent audit of these costs with a charge and access to review these costs in detail and propose streamlining costly processes where it makes sense. We started our presentation by talking about the fact that NAEP is a leader in educational measurement. It does important research on testing innovations, but there isn't an integrated summary of the research that NCES sponsors that describes the vision, the focus, and the costs of this work. So the panel's final recommendation says that NCES should increase the visibility and the coherence of NAEP's research activities with an identifiable budget, innovation strategy, and program of activities so the field knows what NCES is investigating and learning. And then finally, I want to return to the cost data that we looked at the beginning of our discussion. So this is the same, these are the same data that we looked at before. On the left, you'll see descriptions of the work of the program. The middle column shows proportional spending for each of those functions. In this slide, the costs that are shown in red are costs that the panel believes deserve additional examination. And then that final column shows savings that the panel describes in its report. So in the test administration row, the 18.7% of budget savings would be for the move to local administration. The 1.6% would be for the use of longer testing sessions. And then in the scoring row, the 0.7% savings would be for automated scoring. So Lori.
Thank you. My 5 minutes worth of comments are not critiques. They are seconds or compliments and a few additions. So I just want to reiterate that NAEP's most precious asset is its high quality, fulsome representation of subject matter, along with its methodological strengths in ensuring accurate sampling and reporting of achievement for the nation, for states, for large school districts. The panel's report rightly emphasizes that it is these features which ensure the importance and integrity of NAEP that it must preserve as cost savings are pursued. So that's what you say. I'm just saying amen to that. And it shouldn't be lost when we're just looking at cost figures and trying to look for savings. It's very thematic in how you did the work. The panel recommended a more evolutionary ongoing process for the revision of NAEP frameworks. And this is consistent. And obviously you'll see my comments here are tied to the recommendations that are most like the work that I've been involved in most recently with the NAEP Validity Studies panel. And we are making very consistent recommendations about this incremental way of thinking about framework changes, mostly because trends are NAEP's asset, and trends within a 10-year period is what you care about. You don't really care about the construct meaning of the long-term trends. So that's why we're moving in this direction. But we need to think about whether that might have some difficult consequences occasionally. The thing that you recommend to make that happen are standing subject matter committees. And Andrew's heard me recite this, but of course, that's what we recommended in 1997. And it's what we recommended again in the Hartle Future of NAEP report in 2012. Congratulations, what a great idea. The thing I will add that might be not in the text of the comment is that notice that what doing that would do is elevate this. There are committees, but they're buried in the contract work. And the idea is to raise subject matter attention and continuity of subject matter attention to the same level that the Data Analysis Committee has and NBS has. So we have had this longevity of technical feedback to the system and not the same level of continuity for subject matter. And that's what I think that you're recommending. Great idea. A point I would add also is that when revisions are made, they should be explicitly described. This is always available on the website in terms of the research understandings that support those revisions of the construct. And I think maybe subject experts have been reluctant to seem to be claiming a particular viewpoint. So there's been not as much, even when the science framework changes are described, as how they relate to the work that has gone on in the field. So just a slightly more research justification and explanation for those changes. Preserving trend and avoiding new frameworks does sometimes mean that things are changing in the field to which NAEP will be insensitive. And this was demonstrated when we can see how long-term NAEP and main NAEP come to different conclusions about changes in mathematics. And most recently with the Nces study, it raises concerns that people are misunderstanding what NAEP is telling us about the efficacy of Common Core. So if we believe that evolutionary change is the best thing, mine, and this is my peculiar idea, is that we need special studies on occasion, like the Nces study, that NCES makes available to the public so that they can use it to interpret, not change the data, not adjust statistics. That's not what federal statistical agencies do, but have that available to the public so that we can evaluate whether that particular construct meaning is affecting what we're seeing in the data. Lastly, as the gold standard, me too, Andrew, should cost more than other assessments. Not as much more is what I understand from this report. A problem not mentioned in the report, and I think eliminating some of my text here. Jack described to you what they recommend about local administration, and it has great implications for not the same, not uniform, different meaning of standardization. Maybe it could mean equal or fair familiarity. Maybe the uniformity is getting closer to shared. And I just want to call out that that's one instance of what, as knowledge has gotten more complex decade after decade, or let's say our learning sciences understanding of knowledge has gotten more complex decade after decade, we will have to find other ways in large scale assessment programs to have same not be the definition of standardization and fair assessment. Instead, equal attention to context and meaning, some kind of equivalency that's not uniformity is going to be, it's what we're facing in all of our equity considerations for large scale assessment. So wonderful report. Thank you. And Leslie, your turn.
I don't know whose computer this is. Ah, it worked. All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon. Although I'm getting texts from my husband with my children being put to bed. So I know it's nighttime on the East Coast. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Leslie Muldoon. I'm the Executive Director of the National Assessment Governing Board staff, and really pleased to have been invited to provide commentary today. I want to thank the National Academies and thank the members of the panel, those who are here today and those who are not, for the really thoughtful recommendations. And I want to thank ARA for giving us a forum today to discuss this important report. I'll be the third, I guess, to say that NAEP has long been considered the gold standard in student assessment. And the board is absolutely committed to making sure that it maintains that status. And we think that the National Academies report will really help contribute to that future. This is my very simple summary of what we saw when we looked at the National Academies report and our way as a staff of the National Assessment Governing Board in trying to just internalize the recommendations in one concise slide. I think, as we looked at it, we saw that the report's primary goal was really to identify opportunities for innovation with this goal of reducing costs in mind. And we agree. We think that's really critical, that transparency and accountability to ensuring that taxpayer dollars are used towards achieving the best possible value at the best possible cost. That's what we should be doing. That's what every program in the government should be doing. But we also see this as positioning the board and NCS to make data-driven decisions about program priorities and resources moving forward. So the recommendations that the Academies has provided around, in particular in section 2 and section 10, around just more clarity and transparency around the costs and reviewing how our resources are being spent, we think that's really important. The board is currently reviewing and analyzing whether and how to implement each of the recommendations in the report. And we have our next quarterly meeting, May 12th and 13th, and that we have some time dedicated to discussing that. And we're looking forward to taking some immediate actions this year on some of the recommendations. As you'll hear from Commissioner Carr next, when we first saw the report, we saw a lot that was familiar, which was reassuring, right? We saw that many of the initiatives that have been underway, particularly around moving to a more efficient test administration model, really told us that we were on the right track. And so we appreciate that. And Commissioner Carr will share in a few moments some of the timelines, the anticipated timelines around implementing some of these reforms. The report lays out a really pragmatic vision for the future of NAEP. But I think I want to push us in my response to think a little bit more broadly about an innovation agenda for NAEP that not only advances efficiency and cost effectiveness, but that really puts more centrally a focus on the utility and relevance of NAEP for stakeholders and on our responsibility to try to advance the equity through the assessment. And we think this is really crucial for maintaining the quality that has characterized NAEP as the gold standard for decades, and for ensuring it remains useful to the people for whom it is conducted. So earlier this year, the governing board and NCS started to outline a new reimagined future for NAEP. And you'll see on the slide here some of the principles that we discussed with the governing board. In our view, that vision, that future is more nimble and efficient, and focuses on reducing costs without sacrificing data integrity and rigor. So we think that that really aligns well with the vision that the Academies has laid out. But we've put a little bit more emphasis on producing more actionable information for stakeholders. We think that these priorities that I've put up on the screen here are lenses through which we should examine opportunities for innovation. None of these is innovation in and of itself, but they're an important framework for us to consider goals for the future of the program. So I'll just briefly describe these principles, these priorities, and then I want to delve a little bit deeper into relevance, utility, and equity. So quality is absolutely at the core visually and throughout the program. It must remain at the core because the scientific integrity and rigor of NAEP is what defines that gold standard, and we think it absolutely has to be maintained. In terms of utility and relevance, as we were thinking about utility, we were really focusing on state policymakers. And I'll talk more about this in a moment, but we want policymakers to be able to use the data from NAEP, and Lori talked about this in her introduction, right? Making sure that NAEP is a policy relevant instrument. We want policymakers to be able to use the data effectively to support better outcomes for students. Otherwise, all the money we spend and all the work that we do, I don't think is all that useful if people can't use the data to help children, particularly at this moment in time when we know how many students are far behind. In terms of relevance, our focus here is really on providing those individuals, right, the teachers, the students, the schools that we rely on. They commit their time and their energy and resources to participate in the assessment every 2 years in the case of reading and mathematics. What can we do to make the assessment experience more relevant for them and give them information that is useful? And then in terms of equity, this is the theme of the conference. It's been a topic of discussion over at the NCME meeting for the last few days. What can we do to help lead the field in identifying empirically based methods for advancing equity and assessment, and so that we can better understand and help improve student achievement? And then I think that the places where the Academies has given us the most food for thought is in terms of the other two principles here, adaptability and efficiency. It takes a long time to implement updates and changes within the NAEP program, and we have to find ways to become more nimble, to become more adaptable, so that we can continue to assure the program's ongoing relevance. And I think the framework recommendations that Andrew outlined and Lori echoed are really critical, and one that I personally have been taking up in the last few months to try to understand what would that look like, what kind of changes would that require, and how quickly can we move in that kind of a direction. And then finally, in terms of efficiency, this is really crucial. We can't keep adding more and more to NAEP without creating some efficiencies that reduce the burden on the staff of NCS, on the staff of schools, and that reduce costs on the flip side. So then I want to focus in on strengthening NAEP's utility and relevance. Andrew talked about several recommendations that were in the report that I thought were really spot on. I don't think the report devoted enough real estate to that. And I would have loved to have seen more about how we can ensure that the program is meeting the needs of the stakeholders we serve. I'd argue that assessment is at a new crossroads. The landscape continues to evolve. College admissions tests, as we all know, are facing pretty existential threats. State tests are under renewed scrutiny. The fact that the governor of Florida and the teachers unions have aligned around eliminating their end of year assessment is pretty interesting, right? And I think underscores the frustration that many parents and educators feel about large-scale statewide assessment. We're seeing a strong and growing movement for more parental rights in education. I think that's going to further destabilize this environment. And NAEP is required under law, but I don't think we can assume that that foundation will always be so solid, right? We need to make sure that people who are devoting their time and energy to administer the assessment actually value it, right? Continue to value it. So I want to just do a brief walk down in history to 1986, when the Secretary of Education formed a commission to take a fresh look at how the nation was assessing educational achievement and progress. This was the Alexander James Commission formed by Secretary Bennett at the time. And the commission developed a set of recommendations for NAEP, which they said, which I think are extremely relevant to us today. And they were guided by 4 principles. The first was making the nation's report card more useful to states and localities. Second, assuring NAEP's responsiveness to state and local concerns. 3, shielding it from partisan politics. And 4, improving the quality, timeliness, and comprehensiveness of the information it provides. This led in part to the formation of the governing board by Congress in 1988. And I think the board and NCS have done a lot to advance those principles over the last 35 years or so, but that was 35 years ago. And the country's changed, the needs of states have changed, NAEP has certainly changed. And so I think we need to recommit ourselves and renew our focus to understanding and meeting the needs of the intended beneficiaries of NAEP, those states and localities. I think today NAEP is optimized for researchers and data assessment experts who know how to navigate the program's complexities. And those researchers and assessment experts, people here at this conference, are not those state and local leaders who are making the decisions about how to use NAEP data to allocate resources and establish policies to support teaching and learning. So I think we need to focus our future innovation agenda on what would it look like to prioritize relevance and utility for policymakers as much as prioritizing technical integrity. So this is the kind of shift in our thinking that we're making and really pushing ourselves to focus on making NAEP more relevant for states and the large urban districts and communicating more clearly, succinctly, and regularly in policy relevant ways about what NAEP tells us with regard to student achievement and progress. And then finally, equity. This is a national imperative and it was before COVID. COVID has underscored that even further. It's the theme of this conference, but it's a particularly challenging area for assessment. And I think even more so for NAEP. The board is a nonpartisan body, and part of our charge, from the early days of the formation of the concept of the board was to shield NAEP from partisan politics. So we have a responsibility to stay out of these broader debates that are fraught right now about equity. But historically, the board has been able to achieve consensus on really challenging issues. You can see on the screen, well, I don't know if you can actually see that text, but on the right-hand side is how the board handled the definition of equity in the recently updated NAEP reading framework. And that was a hard-fought victory. Right now, as we are looking forward, we're thinking about how to broaden that. How can we try to define equity in the context of NAEP? We can't, nor should we define equity broadly for education, but we can and should consider what's the appropriate definition and role within the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and then what that means for policies and practices from the beginning to the end of the testing process. Jorenda Hughes and others have offered some really outstanding ideas and starting points for us. And the board is prioritizing this work over the rest of the year and looking forward to working with NCS on it. I'd say we're still at the starting point for these discussions, and the field is grappling with these issues. So we really need the best and brightest in education and assessment and research to support this shift and help us figure out how to do it in ways that are really empirically based. And then finally, I want to close with a reminder of how important this work is. Both NAEP itself and the need to innovate and modernize the program. We know that later this year, NAEP is releasing the first assessment results since COVID for this program, and that'll provide the most comprehensive snapshot to date of student achievement and progress since COVID. We've said at the board, and I know Peggy has said as well, that this is the most important NAEP administration ever. And we want to make sure that the assessment is providing the best information possible. So there are steps that we will be taking this year to advance the utility and relevance. And we commit ourselves to the modernization work to ensure the assessment continues to remain the gold standard. So I will close with thanking you again so much for the recommendations. And we hope that we can count on you to work with us as we work to implement them. Thank you.
Leslie, I think it is my turn to comment. Thank you for those inspiring comments. I learned a few things myself in listening to you today. I always do. While my slides are being brought up, I want to thank the program coordinators for allowing me to speak to you today virtually. I could not help it. I would love to have been there with you today. AARA, Felice, and others who made this all happen. Thank you. Thank you so much. My slides are not up yet, but I think I can get started with some of my opening statements. I want to thank this panel, this National Academy panel, for the work it did on this report. The National Center for Education Statistics work collaboratively with this parent organization. I'm not sure that was made clear thus far, the Institute of Education Sciences, IES, to commission this work. It was part of their anniversary, the 20th anniversary of IES. This NASM report is the latest in a series of expert reports on the various subjects or aspects of the program that we have commissioned by NCES over the decades. And this is as stellar as any that I have seen. And I have to say, the panel members themselves, what a distinguished group of experts in the field of large-scale assessment. They know the NAEP program very well. We were just honored to have been supported by their generous intellectual gifts for this report. My slides are not up yet, but I think I can continue to move forward. In general, as you've heard, the report is reassuring in that most of the recommendations concerning modernization speak to many of the innovations that we have been working on for a while now. NAEP does have an innovation agenda, and it is inclusive of nearly all of the ideas explored in this study. And there are more that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. We've been thinking boldly about the next generation of NAEP. So this was a good thing, so reassuring to have experts such as those on this panel to tell us that we are on the right track. And as Leslie has noted, the innovation agenda is aligned with principles, the one that we've been working on even prior to this report, like relevance and utility and equity. Yes, equity, of course. And so it's not just about cost savings. It is about cost savings, but it's not just about cost savings. But the bottom line is that NCES wholeheartedly agrees with some minor tweaks here and there with the majority of the technical recommendations in this study. But I do want to underscore that many of the ideas that were described here are already underway. In fact, we had to speed some of them up as a result of what was happening with the pandemic. So I want to say just a little bit about our big ideas, the Nape Agenda. You've heard some hints, both from the great presentations of the panel members and Leslie as well, that we are going device agnostic. Perhaps you've heard that Nape has been tied by the hip to Surface Pros, but we will be moving away from Surface Pros and looking at other devices and really, quite honestly, adopting some of the strategies that some of the international programs use and the state programs use as we go device agnostic. Utilization of AI, machine learning, and data science is also on our agenda. A lot of NAEP's data science activities really have been behind the scene. And if I can confess that some of them are not very exciting, but those days are changing as well with the advent of more APIs, the use of process data. We were out front with process data or clicks, as you heard Andrew talked about, but we're losing ground, so we've got to catch up again. Other programs have leapfrogged over us with these use of these data in many ways and various components of assessment programs. And yes, automation. We are going to be including automated scoring. We have already started that work in 2022. We started with a special study with reading, and we're going to be moving to math very soon. I'll show you a timeline in just a moment. But we are also very excited about the next generation of eNape platform, which Jack, I think, mentioned, and that is going to allow Nape to be online. We're very excited about that. In 2021, when we had to step up to the plate because of COVID, the program did prove that it could be nimble, it could be flexible. And this was exemplified by the immediate implementation of the monthly Nape survey, which assessed various modes of learning across US schools after the pandemic left the education world in a complete chaos. And perhaps you've heard Leslie and I talk about other bold ideas that we've been considering for the program, such as Nape on Demand for students in virtual academies that are popping up everywhere, and those in home schooling programs, more than we've seen in previous years. So given the synergy between the panel's wonderful technical recommendations and what Nape is already putting in place, I thought I would just take just a moment to update you on where we are with the timeline, because this next generation of Nape is really already underway. So as I mentioned, in 2022, this year, Nape moved towards field testing automated scoring and of constructed response questions, not the short ones, but the longer ones in reading. In 2023, we will be field testing online Nape in many schools across the country, as well as the process and procedures for reducing that footprint of administrators in schools. We think we're going to have to do a hybrid model moving into the future. Everyone won't be ready. Everyone will not, even if they are ready, may not let us in. But we're going to introduce our first procedure for reduction of that footprint in 2023. In 24, we will launch automated scoring for reading and math. 22 is reading, and we're going to do math in 24. Online Nape, you'll see we'll be up and running with online Nape. We'll do a small test, a proof of concept test for going device agnostic. We're looking at Chromebooks. We had some landscape work done across the schools in the country, and about 70% of American schools are using some type of Chromebooks in K-12. So that's where we're going to start. In 2025, you can look forward to us field testing the device agnostic Nape that, as I described, but in many schools in a big way. We will bridge it in, and we'll have a further reduction of this footprint in the schools. You heard Jack talk about, perhaps we should be re-examining how much we can save with this reduction of the footprint. Well, we've had to back that up a little bit because schools are pushing back. They're not totally ready for us to completely disappear. And finally, in 2028, NAEP will look very different to the test takers with a 2-subject design instead of a 1 subject per student. NAEP is really the only one that does this. All of the other ones, PISA, for example, TIMS, for example, have more than 1 subject given to a single student. So we're going to be looking into that. And you've heard the adaptive testing. Will we do MST, multi-stage testing? That will happen in 2028. And you're absolutely right, Jack. It will do very little to save any funds, but it will do a lot, we believe, to improve measurement, particularly at the ends of the distribution. So now I want to get myself into a little trouble by talking about what was not so agreeable about this report. I want to set the stage by quoting a giant and scholar of civil rights. We all know him well, Congressman John Lewis. Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. I've had the pleasure over the course of more than 3 decades working to work with the National Academies, and I know how stellar their work is. I have not always agreed with all of the recommendations or conclusions in those reports over the years, but I have never felt that they did not give it all their best or it was not their best work. But I'm wondering now if this is the first instance of that. Some of what I saw in this report led me to believe that perhaps we need to take a step back. The tone and tenor of this report was different in that it often lacked some objectivity with a narrative that was unsubstantiated by evidence or fact. This is not something the National Academy typically does. And I'm not really talking about the recommendations themselves, but more the text that surrounded it. I know this will get me in trouble, but I feel this is good trouble, necessary trouble in defense of our nation's report card, the national assessment, and the highly qualified professionals that have spent decades of their career developing what I believe is the crown jewel of large-scale assessments that we see today. So where did the tension occur? Well, the challenge was around government rules. That's right, there are government rules and policies. Our contracts office would not allow us to share proprietary information at unit cost levels. And so we simply just could not give the panel what they really needed to make some of those conclusions, but the conclusions were made anyway. And I think in some cases, it was an unfortunate choice. Not many, but in a couple. To that extent, I want to say that NCS agrees that the program is large and complex and that it is reflected in the cost structure. We agree with that. But it's also important to note that the panel's estimates of program costs was admittedly, and this is admitted in the report, was incomplete, and in some cases, I'm sharing that they were inaccurate. NCS agrees with the panel that a program as large as NAEP should have periodic cost reviews, and that's exactly what we're going to do. NCS has plans already underway to conduct an independent cost structure review of its program. But NCS also underscores that such a cost review should be conducted by highly qualified professionals knowledgeable of large-scale assessments, not just auditors. And that review should not extend to the legislative governance of NAEP by NCES and Nagb, as I believe one of the recommendations sort of hints to. So I've got myself into a little bit of trouble, but I'm going to declare it was good trouble. And I want to end by saying that I want to reiterate that I appreciate the focus on innovation. As Leslie pointed out, NCS and the governing board are working in partnership on an aggressive innovation agenda, one that is founded on the principles that will allow us to better serve NAEP stakeholders. I believe strongly in partnership, innovation, and equity. And those are the pillars of all of what I want to do as the commissioner of NCES. I appreciate the effort and dedicated time of this very distinguished panel of experts. NCS will continue to review the report and its recommendations for their relevance and value in charting the path of the next generation of NAEP. Thank you.
Realized that I have been passed the torch as moderator. Is this on? Is this working? Great. I promise to be as neutral as I can be in my moderating role. I guess I can start by asking Jack and Karen if they have any responses or questions for Leslie or Peggy, and then we can turn it to the audience to see if there are any questions there. Lori did suggest that I would have some closing remarks. My closing remarks will be to close this session. I've remarked enough. But let me start with Jack and Karen, see if you have any responses to Leslie or Peggy.
Sure. So first of all, thank you both for your thorough comments. And really, Andrew mentioned it, and Karen mentioned it earlier, but assistance throughout the production of this report, there's a lot of material that we had to look at, that we had to ask for. Sometimes we didn't know about it until we asked for something else. I've rarely worked on something with so broad a scope as this report, and we couldn't have done it without the assistance of both of your staffs and organizations, and we thank you. I have very little to object to. I think at least, this is always tricky too, because this is a consensus report. So when we stand up there and talk about the recommendations, we're speaking for the panel and not with our own, role or thoughts in mind. I would, Peggy, I don't feel like you were trying to get in too much trouble there. I think we were pretty clear as panelists that this is really complicated, and we were chosen partly because we do understand generally what things cost, but we also understand how assessments work. And that is really different than like forensic accounting, right? Or going through line by line and that's why we recommended it. And I think that is the only way forward, is an independent look at the cost. And we wouldn't, I stand by and I think the panel stands by recommendations in the direction of saying this is likely to cut costs, this is not. But the details there, anyone would need a lot more information. And I take no objection to your objection.
Right. And Jack, I agree. I really resonated with what Peggy said about the need for examining the cost data for a program as important as this. And I think both recommendations, 2.1 and 10.1, the 2.1 is the one that said clearer descriptions of the cost data and their relationship to the components of the program would be helpful in decision making about the program moving forward. And then the latter one is about the independent audit. And I think both of those work in both of those directions will be beneficial to the program and to the value that it holds to the important audiences that Leslie described.
I'll just add one small thing. I took my moderator hat off and put my panelist hat back on. When I was on the governing board and chaired the Committee on Standards Design and Methodology, I always reminded people at every meeting that partnerships were very important, and no more important partnership was the one between the governing board and the National Center for Educational Statistics. And I was just very pleased to see a joint statement and a joint framework between the governing board and the National Center for Education Statistics that Leslie presented and Peggy reinforced. And that is not trivial. And I applaud it and hope that our recommendations will continue to be taken up by both of you separately, but also both agencies separately, but also together in coordination. So that's great to see. And okay, now I'll put my moderator hat back on. Wait, Jack, did you want to follow up with something as well? No. Okay, great. Wonderful. We'll now open for questions from the audience, both physical and virtual. And George, if you, I see your hand up, if you could go to the microphone that's just behind you, then everyone who's listening out there in the virtual world will be able to hear you as well.
Hi, Peggy, George Bornstead. Want to say hello. Did the board consider what seems to some of us to be an obvious cost saving by thinking about moving reading and writing to making a recommendation that Congress change reading and writing to be administered every 4 years instead of every 2 years, since that would seem to be a big cost saving. Now, having said that, I'd also make another recommendation which would cost more money. I surely wish that writing was assessed more often. It's such a hugely important subject. It should be every 4 years as well.
Well, you guys, welcome to jump in, but essentially we, as Karen noted, not that we didn't discuss things like that, but we left off the table either canceling assessment or changing periodicity. Not to say it just sort of is outside the scope of the sorts of things we were trying to look at. Like, you don't need an expert bunch of people sitting around to tell you to do it less often to save money. So I'm not disagreeing, but I'm saying that was sort of outside the scope.
Right. And then I think the recommendation to combine subjects that have synergies like reading and writing, George, gets at your second comment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if there were assessments that looked at both subjects in tandem, I think you'd get more information, and the assessment of writing would obviously happen more frequently.
And on that note, I would agree, of course. Also, the panel was concerned that the construct out in the States and that most policymakers and parents and families are used to is more of an English language arts combination of reading and writing. And as NAEP continues to keep them separate, it gets more and more confusing. And so I think that integration recommendation does definitely speak to that problem.
I will just add that the periodicity is something that, thanks to the pandemic, I am very appreciative of, right? At the 2 years instead of 4 years, right? But also that just to support your point of writing, I was at a discussion earlier today about measuring learning loss through the pandemic and the sort of gap, because interim assessments don't often measure or emphasize writing. The little evidence we have about writing suggests that there were even greater potentially declines there than even that you see in reading. So that's going to be really important moving forward to measure. Moderator Pat back on. Any other questions from the audience, or again, virtual or in person? All good in the virtual world? Crickets? Well, if the panelists and Peggy and Leslie don't have anything further, I'm happy to adjourn. I have to run to the NCME presidential address in any case. Maybe I'll see some of you there. And again, thank you to everybody. And with, again, moderator hat back on. The panel, thank you to the panel for the presentations. Thank you to Leslie for bringing me water. I very much appreciate it. I'm feeling much better. And thank you all to the audience for your interest and engagement. We look forward and hope that these recommendations will continue to be taken up.